AA only works thoroughly or effectively as a spirituality. That is to say, when it involves a relationship with the higher power. And this is why I have raised the question whether it would not help the 12-step program to introduce that relationship of to the higher power, which is not just discursive meditation or vocal prayer, but the kind of prayer that centering prayer is, a relationship beyond concepts and ideas earlier in the steps. That's what I consider could be missing in the early steps. And you can't get to the unconscious without some form of non-conceptual meditation. Thinking, for some reason, thinking about things, and that's what rationalizes and goes into denial, is what prevents us from experiencing head-on the contents of the unconscious. So when he started doing that, as his letters suggest, then he got out of the depression right away. So I think that's an area for discussion among those who have a lot of experience of AA and the spiritual journey. But I think the two could go together at an earlier period of the process. If AA works well, if the 12-step problem works well, it will teach you all these things anyway. And what I'm saying will not teach you anything unless you experience it. So it's this combination or relationship of an explanation or at least some idea of what the root problem is. As Jesus says, it's more important to heal the roots of the tree if you want good fruit, because if you don't, the diseased roots will continue to produce bad fruit no matter how much you clip off the branches. And he uses that image even more profoundly in, I am the vine and you are the branches. To abide in me, you must abide in the vine. And the idea being, if we are going to bring forth divine fruits, or the fruits of the gospel, or the values of the gospel, the beatitudes and the fruits, we have to be rooted in the divine presence within us. Then we can see the divine presence everywhere else. And without that rootedness, every self-help program is questionable how far it can go. If it doesn't get into the unconscious motivation, it is not going far enough. The journey is all about the God and more particularly the experience of the divine presence. I emphasize experience of the divine presence because this is what relativizes all the other our attachments to anything less than God. Something I noticed when I was at the rehab center in Gateway, one of the new clients who was there to dry off in order to have a baby without the influence of the cocaine that I guess, or the alcohol that she would otherwise be doing if she were out on the street. But she said she had terrible suffering while she was, struggling with alcohol and drugs. Then she got sober, at least for a few months. And then she said she felt worse, more pain than before. This made a tremendous impression on me because and I don't know quite, I wouldn't have known quite what to answer. She asked that question actually directly of me at the end of my presentation. And what it said to me is that the root of any addiction is some pain in regard to life, rejection, abandonment, loss of a loved one, some unbearable pain that an addiction at least relieves in some degree. and that when the addiction is no more through sobriety, the pain is going to return unless you do something else to address the roots of that pain. And this is what the centering prayer practice is about. And that's why it raises the question for me whether it, at least the practice itself, might not be helpful to a certain number of people who are trying to get rooted in AA. Because the human condition is, and its problems are so acute that underneath every addiction is the addictive process. And the addictive process is rooted in the human condition with the emotional programs for happiness and over-identification. If we could just communicate that much of the program to new persons, and a period in which they rest in their faith in their own basic goodness, that it's been, that now they're in the land of enlightenment, they can come back. Some hope has to be given to people in great pain. And I believe there is hope that can be offered to them. But they have to freely accept it. I've always thought myself that if centering prayer could be introduced a little earlier than the 11th step, it might facilitate all the other steps. But I'm not sure. In actual fact, in Christian tradition, there are a lot of other steps before coming to contemplation. And the idea of starting people off with a contemplative practice strikes a number of very respectable and traditional teachers as inappropriate. But you see, when we teach centering prayer, we also accompany it very soon after with teaching about the practice called Lectio Divina, which is a way of listening to the scriptures from a prayerful perspective and using the faculties as a way of getting acquainted, you might say, or establishing an acquaintance and a friendly relationship with the persons who are described in the scripture, especially with Jesus Christ, of course. And so centering prayer also has preliminaries that are very helpful. We also found that in the historical conditions in which we first taught centering prayer, that people were not interested in Lectio Divina at that point, in rituals, in liturgy, or anything else. They were alerted from the incursion of the Eastern spiritual experts that came to this country in great numbers after the World War II and are still coming. And they're welcome to them because they arrived on our shores saying, here is our method into meditation, what we would mean by contemplation. Where's yours? Or what is it? And there was no answer to that in those days. And that was part of my inspiration in trying to put the Christian mystical tradition into some form comparable to a method, because we live in an age when everybody has to have a book on how to before they do anything. So centering prayer was designed to provide a Christian presence in the marketplace, because Christians and Catholics, and maybe some of you, never having heard about the contemplative dimension of the gospel in Catholic schools or in any religious schools, or even in seminaries, were seeking, if they were interested in spirituality, out some Eastern guru or master or teacher. And in fact, in the late 60s, early 70s, the figures I've seen reported that maybe 10,000 young people were heading for India every summer in search of spirituality or a guru. What does that say about the Jewish and Christian religions? of whom many who were going were members. It says that they didn't cross their mind that there was anything comparable in the Christian or Jewish religion. That's why we put centering prayer into a method. And so when they came to the monastery to check us out, way down the line, because most of these young people have never heard of a monastery even, we were able to speak to them in comparable terms, and so that's what we've been doing since then. And many folks who have Christians with a deeply Christian background have been through Eastern traditions, found them extremely helpful, but also if they were in reaction to their Christian religion, as many of them had rejected it. The practice of Eastern meditation reduced their anger sufficiently that they were able to reconsider returning to their roots. And believe it or not, some of these people are our best people. I go back, I mean, they were enriched by the East. And at least then when they heard there is a Christian practice that's comparable, and indeed a very rich tradition, because we're not the only one presenting Christian mystical tradition, they wanted to return to the religion of their roots and did so. Now the question arises for you in AA, whether the knowledge or at least experience of a method of meditation could help the process itself. And I personally think it could, but I don't have that much experience of AA. I just see that we were able to do without that preliminary process in the Christian introduction of centering prayer. The advantage of a meditation practice is that if you touch base with the experience, it puts meaning into all the other steps, into all the other things. You see for the first time what prayer is about, what vocal prayer is, what ritual does, what sacraments do, spiritual reading, good works. They're all moving in the same direction to open us to the fact that really at the deepest level of truth, God is what is most important in every event and in every person. And that if we are in contact in some degree with that presence, then we become transmitters or channels in some degree of the divine goodness, which is incredibly powerful, though secret. Remember, God operates at a level that transcends all our apparatus to interpret it. It's like these subatomic energies. We don't perceive him with our three-dimensional world apparatus, but with proper, microscopes and so on. These energies can be perceived, or even in now, as an example, in this room is full of radio waves, telephone waves, television waves, and neutrinos from outer space. The place is loaded. But we have no apparatus with our bare hands to contact this part of reality. So it is that the greatest part of God's reality is the divine energy in its purity so far surpasses any apparatus that we have of recognizing, knowing it, or feeling it. That all we can ever perceive is just a tiny, reduced speck of it. Augustine has the delightful phrase that the Eucharist, for instance, is the milk that God provides for us in this life because our stomachs, our tastes aren't ready for the solid food of the divine essence. In other words, we're not ready to assimilate the meat, so to speak, and potatoes of the divine essence. So all that we can receive are little trickles or hints of that manifest themselves in a certain peace, a certain at-homeness, sometimes spiritual consolation, and sometimes very high gifts of enlightenment. But the highest enlightenment is sheer darkness compared to the pure light of God's presence. And that energy is totally available, provided you're willing to believe it, to accept it in faith and relate to it. And as you do relate to it, you find out that its effects are working in your life in the point of transformation. So now you move not from a series of devotions to God, of trying to get along with the old man, you might say, the father, to use Papa, instead of trying to please Papa to get what you want, or to manipulate him to get what we'd like to have, we begin to love him on his own terms, and love is basically surrender. And surrender then puts us in an attitude in which God can transform us. So centering prayer is a transformative practice. As if I understand the 12 steps correctly, they are transformative. They are a way of life. What is missing to me in AA is this dimension of wisdom that is reserved for the 11th step. And perhaps wisely, but remember Bill W. and the others came out of a milieu and were being advised by a Catholic nun and a wonderful Catholic priest, who's something of a saint, named Ed Dowling. And they didn't have this view of the Christian mystical life yet. It was only being renewed gradually, and it was only with Merton and other outstanding people, only in the last 25 or 30 years that the tradition is being looked at, and that the great texts of the past are being translated into English, and so on. So here's where cultural conditioning comes in. Is the idea that you can't teach Christian contemplation without putting people through discursive meditation and vocal prayers and acts, is that the way you have to do it? Well, that's what the tradition says you do. What's a little original about centering prayer, although it reflects the tradition, is that it starts with God instead of with us. If we can do this successfully with centering prayer, without all the preliminaries, and start out with the experience of meditation, is it possible that AA and the steps could be enriched, and by starting the 11th step, not so much in the fullness of the 11th step, but starting the practice of meditation at least a little earlier, while accompanying the 12 steps? That's my question, and that's why I went to Gateway and we had an experiment there, and I don't know how it's going to go. I think that some people coming in off the street are too confused to get it. I imagine maybe 10% might benefit from it. But remember, in centering prayer, if we give an introductory, at the most half will pursue it, and that's high. And then after the 6-week follow-up, maybe another half will drop out. But is it worth, is the progress of those people worth putting it out there? I think those who don't do it, it won't do them any harm. They just won't do it. But I think it needs, a lot more consultation and dialogue and thought. So with such outstanding people with so much experience, I hesitate to suggest but I see an analogy between centering prayer and the 12-step program. We were able to do it without the preliminaries to great advantage, because then when they got back into the preliminaries, the Spirit sends you back. If you skip a few steps, he sends you back to fill them in later on. But now you fill them in with a much greater insight, because you realize where they're going, and you have a much stronger motivation to pursue the centering prayer practice. And the preliminaries, and so you work the thing into all your faculties. In other words, I think that the steps of Lectio Divina, for instance, are an dynamic process of relating, that you can go back and forth and can even enter into the rest of contemplative prayer even from the beginning. But since it's based on a rather fragile foundation, the Spirit sends you back to the other steps, and you move around with a certain spontaneity according to each person's need.